Is Palestine a country, or is it Israel? That's the question millions of people are afraid to ask out loud. So today we're answering it with history, not headlines. Long before the word Israel appeared on any modern map, the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea had a name. The Romans called it Palestina. The Arabs called it Palestine. For over 1,000 years, the people who lived there, farmers, merchants, families rooted in olive groves that predated any nation-state, simply called it home. By the 7th century, the region had become part of the Arab and Islamic world. Jerusalem, Hebron, Nablus, Gaza, Jaffa, Acre. These weren't foreign names. They were living cities, with mosques, churches, and synagogues standing on the same streets. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities coexisted there for centuries, under different rulers, through different empires. That coexistence is a fact often erased from the modern conversation. Jewish communities in cities like Safed, Hebron, and Jerusalem had lived there continuously for generations, long before any political movement to create a Jewish state existed. This matters because the history of Palestine was never a history of one people erasing another. It was a shared, layered history, until outside powers decided to redraw it. For 400 years, from 1516 to 1917, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. It had its own administrative districts, organized under what the Ottomans called sanjaks, with Jerusalem eventually elevated to its own special district due to its religious significance. It had its own agriculture, its own trade routes, its own social fabric. Palestinian villages exported oranges, soap, and olive oil across the Mediterranean, with Jaffa oranges becoming a recognized export brand in European markets by the late 1800s. Palestinian families held land deeds, registered under Ottoman law, that in many cases are still held by their descendants today, sometimes as nothing more than paper reminders of homes they can no longer reach. This wasn't an empty stretch of desert waiting to be discovered. It was a functioning, populated Arab society with cities, courts, schools, and newspapers. Then came the First World War. The Ottoman Empire, weakened, and fractured decades of decline, collapsed under the weight of a global conflict it could not sustain. And with that collapse, the fate of Palestine was no longer decided by the people living on it. It was decided in the offices of European powers thousands of miles away, powers that were, at that very moment, carving up the entire Middle East for their own strategic advantage. In 1917, in the middle of that war, the British government issued a single letter that would alter the course of history. It's known as the Balfour Declaration. In it, Britain expressed support for, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. One sentence. No referendum. No consultation with the Arab population, who made up roughly 90% of the people actually living there at the time. Let that sink in. 90% of the population was Arab Palestinian. And a foreign government, one that didn't even control the land yet, promised it as a homeland to another people, while the actual residents were mentioned only as, quote, the existing non-Jewish communities, not named, not consulted, treated as a footnote in their own homeland. An entire population, with its own cities, farms, and identity, reduced to a subordinate clause in someone else's letter. Britain didn't fully control Palestine at the time it made this promise. That's the part most people don't know. The declaration was written while the Ottomans still held the region. Britain was making a promise about land it didn't yet possess to serve its own wartime strategic interests, courting financial and political support from Zionist organizations in Europe and the United States, while simultaneously making separate, conflicting promises to Arab leaders about post-war independence in exchange for their support against the Ottomans. By 1918, British forces had taken Palestine from the Ottomans. In 1920, the League of Nations formalized British control through what was called the Mandate for Palestine. On paper, mandates were supposed to prepare local populations for eventual self-governance and independence. In practice, in Palestine, the mandate became the mechanism through which large-scale Jewish immigration was facilitated. Land purchases were legally protected and encouraged, and Palestinian Arab political representation was systematically sidelined. Unlike other mandates in the region, which moved toward Arab self-rule within a couple of decades, Palestine's mandate was structured differently from the outset, with the Balfour Declaration's language written directly into its legal text. Between 1920 and the mid-1940s, the Jewish population in Palestine grew from roughly 10% to around 30%, driven by waves of immigration, first for ideological and economic reasons tied to the Zionist movement, and later urgently as Jewish refugees fled escalating persecution and eventually genocide in Europe. That history of suffering is real, and it matters. It does not erase what was happening simultaneously to the people already living on that land, whose homeland was being reshaped without their consent as a response to a crisis they did not create. As the demographic balance shifted, tensions rose sharply. Palestinian Arabs staged strikes, protests, and eventually a sustained uprising between 1936 and 1939, demanding an end to unrestricted Jewish immigration and land transfers, and demanding the political independence that other Arab territories were being promised elsewhere in the post-Ottoman world. Britain responded with overwhelming force. Villages were placed under curfew. Political leaders were exiled. Homes were demolished as collective punishment. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, wounded, or imprisoned during the suppression of that revolt. This was not a footnote. It was one of the largest sustained anti-colonial uprisings in the Arab world at the time, and it barely appears in most Western history books, even though it fundamentally shaped British policy in the years leading up to World War II. By the end of World War II, the situation had become, in the eyes of the international community, unsustainable. Britain, exhausted from war, financially depleted, and unable to manage the escalating conflict between Jewish and Arab communities, now compounded by attacks from Jewish paramilitary groups fighting to end British rule entirely, handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. Here's where the story reaches its first true turning point. In November of 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted on Resolution 181, a plan to partition Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish, with Jerusalem placed under international administration due to its religious significance to three faiths. At the time of this vote, Jewish residents owned less than 10% of the total land in Palestine and made up roughly a third of the population. Yet the partition plan allocated over 50% of the territory to the proposed Jewish state, including the fertile coastal plain. Palestinian Arab leadership rejected the plan, not because they rejected the idea of Jewish people living in the region. Jewish communities had lived there for generations already, and no serious historical account claims otherwise. But because the plan handed away the majority of a land where they were still the clear majority of the population, without their consent, decided once again by outside powers sitting in New York, rather than the people who would actually live with the consequences. The Jewish leadership at the time accepted the partition plan, viewing it as a foundational step toward long-sought statehood after centuries of persecution, culminating in the horrors of the Holocaust. And with that split decision, one side accepting, one side rejecting a plan it saw as fundamentally unjust, the stage was set for what would come next, a war that would permanently reshape the map, displace hundreds of thousands of people, and create a wound that has never fully healed, more than 75 years later. Before we go further into 1948, the year that changed everything, I want to pause and tell you something important. This channel, Days Gone By, exists to keep telling these histories that so often get buried or rewritten. If you want to wear that message, we made a shirt called Rooted in Dignity, a Palestine Solidarity t-shirt that directly supports this channel, and a portion of every sale goes towards supporting humanitarian relief for Palestinians. It's available for anyone who wants to carry this history with them, not just watch it scroll by. Now back to where we left off, because what happened in the months following that UN vote is where the modern conflict truly begins. As soon as the partition plan was announced, violence erupted across Palestine. Armed Jewish militias, some formally organized, like the Haganah, and others considered paramilitary or even extremist by the standards of the time, like the Irgun and Lehi, began a series of coordinated military operations. Palestinian Arab irregulars, local militias and volunteers from neighboring Arab countries responded in kind. Both sides suffered losses. But by early 1948, one side held vastly superior organization, training, funding, and weaponry from international backers, and it showed clearly in the outcome of the fighting. Villages began to empty out. Some residents fled fighting temporarily, expecting to return within weeks, the way displaced civilians often do in the middle of any war. Others were forcibly expelled through direct military operations, campaigns later documented in detail by historians on multiple sides of the political spectrum, including Israeli, Palestinian, and independent international scholars. Entire towns were depopulated, their residents scattered into neighboring countries, and refugee camps that, for many families, became permanent. This mass displacement, which Palestinians call the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe, would ultimately see over 700,000 Palestinians pushed from their homes before the war even fully concluded. On May 14, 1948, in the middle of this unfolding displacement, the State of Israel formally declared its independence. The very next day, neighboring Arab states declared war, and the First Arab-Israeli War began in earnest, a war whose outcome would determine borders, refugee status, and the fate of an entire people for generations to come. We're going to walk through exactly what happened during that war, village by village, decision by decision, in the next part of this series. Because understanding 1948 is the key to understanding everything that has happened since. Every subsequent war, every refugee camp, every checkpoint, every headline you see today. Before we move forward, if this kind of history matters to you, the kind that gets left out of textbooks, hit subscribe to Days Gone By. We're rebuilding this story piece by piece, and there's a lot more ground to cover. Part 2 picks up exactly where we just left off. The War of 1948, the villages that disappeared from the map, and the birth of a refugee crisis that is still unresolved more than 75 years later. We left off at the edge of war, May 15, 1948. Israel had just declared independence, and 5 Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, entered Palestine, framing their intervention as a defense of the Arab population whose homeland was being partitioned without its consent. What followed would become the defining trauma of modern Palestinian history, a war whose consequences are still being lived out today, generation after generation, back in refugee camps from Lebanon to Gaza. But to understand this war correctly, we have to be precise about something most retellings get wrong. The fighting didn't start on May 15th. It started the moment the UN partition vote passed in November 1947, 6 months earlier. That earlier phase, often called the Civil War period, was fought between Jewish and Arab communities inside Palestine itself, without the formal involvement of neighboring Arab armies. And it was during this earlier phase, not the later, more famous war, that the most consequential events for Palestinian civilians actually took place. By April 1948, weeks before Israel had even declared statehood, Jewish forces had already launched a series of offensives designed to secure and expand the territory allotted to the future Jewish state, and in many cases, to secure territory beyond it. This is a critical point. The partition plan gave the Jewish state around 55% of the land. By the time the war concluded in 1949, the new state of Israel controlled roughly 78% of historic Palestine, nearly a quarter more than what had been allocated by the United Nations just 2 years earlier. That expansion did not happen through diplomacy. It happened village by village, through military campaigns that Israeli historians themselves, including scholars who had access to declassified Israeli military archives, have documented extensively since the late 1980s. One of the most cited of these campaigns is known as Plan Dalet, finalized in March 1948. Plan Dalet outlined a systematic strategy for securing Jewish-controlled territory by clearing Arab villages within and around it, through a combination of destruction, expulsion, and occupation of strategic points. What that meant on the ground was devastating. Entire Palestinian towns were emptied. Deir Yassin, a village near Jerusalem, became one of the most infamous incidents of the war. In April 1948, Fighters from the Irgun and Lehi militias entered the village and killed over 100 Palestinian residents, including women and children, according to accounts corroborated by Red Cross representatives present in the region at the time. News of the massacre spread rapidly through Arab communities, in part because both Jewish and Arab media at the time publicized it, for very different reasons. Jewish military leadership at times used the fear generated by Deir Yassin as psychological leverage, while Arab media used it to rally resistance. The result, either way, was mass panic. Palestinian families across the country, hearing what had happened, began fleeing their homes in terror, often with nothing more than what they could carry, expecting to return once the fighting settled. They never got the chance. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, more than 400 Palestinian villages had been depopulated, and in most cases, physically destroyed or repurposed. Homes were bulldozed. Agricultural terraces that Palestinian farming families had built and maintained for generations were left to erode. In many cases, new Israeli towns and forests were established directly on top of the ruins, a fact documented by Israeli land registries themselves. Some of these forests, planted by the Jewish National Fund in the years following the war, were specifically designed to cover the remains of destroyed Palestinian villages. A detail confirmed by Israeli researchers who cross-referenced forestry planting records with pre-1948 village maps. This is not a matter of political interpretation. It is documented land use history, verifiable through property records, aerial photography, and military archives that both Israeli and international historians have accessed. By the end of the war, over 700,000 Palestinians had been displaced from their homes, roughly 80% of the Arab population that had lived within what became the borders of the new state of Israel. Some fled to the West Bank, which came under Jordanian control. Others fled to the Gaza Strip, which came under Egyptian administration. Still others crossed into Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan proper, where many of their descendants remain in refugee camps to this day, more than 75 years later. In December 1948, the United Nations passed Resolution 194, which affirmed that Palestinian refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return. That resolution has never been implemented. Not in 1949, not in 1967, not in 1993 during the Oslo peace process, not today. It remains, on paper, one of the longest-standing unresolved refugee mandates in the history of the United Nations, and one of the least discussed in mainstream Western media. Meanwhile, on the other side of this history, it's important to be factually honest about something else. Roughly 800,000 Jewish people were also displaced during this same period, expelled or forced to flee from Arab and Muslim-majority countries, such as Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya, largely in the years following Israel's creation, amid rising hostility toward Jewish communities across the region in response to the war. Most of these Jewish refugees resettled in the new state of Israel. This detail matters because a fully honest history doesn't erase suffering on either side. It simply insists on naming all of it accurately, in its proper context, without using one tragedy to erase or minimize another. By 1949, the war had ended with armistice lines, not final borders, but temporary ceasefire lines that would later be treated, in practice, as de facto boundaries. Israel controlled the areas allotted to it under partition, plus significant additional territory taken during the fighting. Jordan controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the Old City and its holy sites. Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. Palestine, as a political entity with its own sovereignty, ceased to exist on any map. Palestinians who remained within the new borders of Israel, roughly 150,000 of them, became a minority population inside the new state and were placed under Israeli military rule for nearly 2 decades, until 1966, with restrictions on movement, land ownership, and political organizing that mirrored in structure, if not in name, martial law. This is the part of the story that so many people never hear. Palestinian citizens of Israel existed and still exist today, making up roughly 20% of Israel's population. Their history inside the state is its own complex thread, one of formal citizenship existing alongside decades of land confiscation, unequal municipal funding, and a legal and social status that has been described by human rights organizations, including some Israeli ones, as structurally unequal. Now, before we go further into what happened after 1948, the decades of exile, the rise of Palestinian political movements, and the war that would reshape the map yet again in 1967, I want to take a quick moment. This channel exists to tell exactly the kind of history we just walked through, the kind that gets buried under headlines and simplified narratives. If this history means something to you, we made a shirt called Rooted in Dignity, a Palestine Solidarity t-shirt that directly supports Days Gone By, and a portion of every sale goes toward humanitarian relief efforts for Palestinians. It's a way to carry this story with you, beyond just watching it. Now, back to 1949. The armistice lines held, technically for nearly 2 decades. But held doesn't mean peaceful. Border skirmishes were constant. Palestinian refugees, now scattered across Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria, lived in makeshift camps that were supposed to be temporary. Tents became cinder block structures. Cinder block structures became permanent neighborhoods. An entire generation of Palestinians was born stateless, holding travel documents instead of passports, growing up with keys to homes they had never seen, passed down as physical symbols of a return that never came. During this period, a Palestinian national political identity, distinct from the broader pan-Arab nationalism of the time, began to solidify specifically around the experience of dispossession. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded, initially under the sponsorship of the Arab League, with the explicit goal of representing Palestinian political aspirations on the international stage. It would go on to become the dominant political vehicle for Palestinian nationalism for decades, shaping everything from armed resistance movements to eventual diplomatic negotiations with Israel. But before the PLO could fully establish itself, the map of the region was about to change again, dramatically and suddenly, in a war that lasted only 6 days, but altered the borders of the Middle East for the rest of the century. That's where we're headed in Part 3, the 1967 war, the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and the beginning of what much of the international community now refers to simply as the occupation, a legal and political reality that continues to shape daily Palestinian life to this very day. If you've made it this far, do us a favor and hit subscribe to Days Gone By. This history deserves to be told in full, not in fragments, and we're not done yet. Part 3 picks up right here, 1967, and the 6 days that redrew the entire region. By 1967, nearly 2 decades had passed since the Nakba. Palestinian refugees were now raising children in exile, most of whom had never set foot in the homes their families had fled. The armistice lines from 1949 had held, technically, but the region remained a tinderbox. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were rearming with Soviet support. Israel, backed increasingly by the United States and France, was doing the same. Rhetoric on all sides had grown sharper, and in the spring of 1967, that tension finally broke. In late May, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, a move Israel considered an act of war given its dependence on that waterway for trade with Asia and East Africa. Egypt also expelled United Nations peacekeeping forces that had been stationed in the Sinai Peninsula since 1957 and began massing troops near the Israeli border. Syria and Jordan signed mutual defense pacts with Egypt in the days that followed. From the Arab side, this was framed as a defensive posture in the face of perceived Israeli aggression and repeated border skirmishes throughout the preceding year. From the Israeli side, it was read as an existential threat, a coalition forming on multiple fronts simultaneously. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive airstrike against Egypt, destroying the majority of the Egyptian Air Force while it was still on the ground. Within hours, Israel had achieved near total air superiority across the region. Jordan, honoring its defense pact with Egypt, entered the war on the same day, and Syria followed shortly after. What followed became known as the Six-Day War, and by the time it ended on June 10th, the map of the Middle East had been redrawn more dramatically than at any point since 1948. Israel emerged from the war in control of the entire Sinai Peninsula, taken from Egypt, the Golan Heights, taken from Syria, and, most consequentially for Palestinians, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, taken from Jordan, along with the Gaza Strip, taken from Egypt. For the first time since 1948, all of historic Palestine, the entirety of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, came under a single governing authority, the State of Israel. This is the moment that many people, when they picture the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are actually picturing, whether they realize it or not. Because it was in 1967 that the modern occupation began. The checkpoints, the settlements, the military administration over millions of Palestinian civilians who suddenly found themselves living under a government they had no vote in, no representation within, and no citizenship from. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the United Nations passed Security Council Resolution 242, which called for, among other things, the withdrawal of Israeli forces from territories occupied in the conflict, in exchange for peace and recognized borders with all regional states. The precise wording of that resolution, whether it meant withdrawal from the territories or simply territories, has been debated by diplomats and legal scholars for decades, and that ambiguity, intentional or not, has shaped nearly 60 years of subsequent negotiation. What is not ambiguous is what happened on the ground in the years that followed. Israel did not fully withdraw. Instead, a new and permanent reality began to take shape. Almost immediately after the war, Israel began establishing civilian settlements in the newly occupied West Bank and Gaza. The first of these settlements, Kfar Etzion, was established within months of the war's end. Over the following decades, this practice expanded dramatically, backed by a combination of government land policy, religious nationalist ideology, and, in many cases, direct state funding and infrastructure support. Today, more than 700,000 Israeli settlers live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in communities connected by roads and infrastructure that Palestinian residents in the very same territory are, in many cases, legally barred from using. The international legal consensus on these settlements has remained remarkably consistent since 1967. The Fourth Geneva Convention, which governs the conduct of occupying powers, explicitly prohibits an occupying power from transferring its own civilian population into territory it occupies. The International Court of Justice, the United Nations Security Council, and the vast majority of the international community, including close allies of Israel, have repeatedly affirmed that the settlements violate international law. Israel disputes this characterization, arguing that the West Bank is disputed rather than occupied territory, given that no sovereign Palestinian state existed there prior to 1967, and that Jordan's own claim to the territory was never broadly internationally recognized, either. This is one of the most significant points of legal and political disagreement in the entire conflict, and both sides' arguments deserve to be understood, even if the international legal consensus leans clearly in one direction. For Palestinians living under occupation, the practical reality of daily life changed enormously after 1967. Movement between towns required passing through military checkpoints. Building permits for homes, businesses, schools, even water infrastructure required approval from Israeli military authorities. And in the years since, the overwhelming majority of Palestinian permit applications in certain zones of the West Bank have been denied, according to data published by Israeli human rights organizations that monitor the military planning system directly. Palestinian agricultural land was, and continues to be, subject to confiscation for settlement expansion, military use, or the construction of a separation barrier that Israel began building in the early 2000s, ostensibly for security purposes, but whose route frequently extends beyond the internationally recognized 1967 boundary line, cutting through Palestinian farmland, and in some cases, physically separating Palestinian families from their own fields. It's worth pausing here to be fair and precise about something important. Israel's stated justification for many of these security measures is rooted in a very real history of attacks against Israeli civilians, including bus bombings, shootings, and stabbings carried out by Palestinian militant groups over the following decades. That violence killed and injured thousands of Israeli civilians, and it is not something a factual account can or should minimize. The security architecture that emerged after 1967, and especially after the uprisings that followed, was built in direct response to that violence, even as its scope and impact on the civilian Palestinian population expanded far beyond what many international observers consider proportionate or lawful. East Jerusalem deserves particular attention here because of its religious and political significance. Shortly after the 1967 war, Israel formally annexed East Jerusalem, extending Israeli law over the area, including the Old City, home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, the Western Wall, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, sites sacred to Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, respectively. This annexation has never been recognized by the United Nations or the overwhelming majority of the international community, which continues to regard East Jerusalem as occupied territory and considers the city's final status to be a matter still requiring negotiated resolution. Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem hold a unique and precarious legal status. They are considered permanent residents of Israel, not citizens, a status that can be and has been revoked by Israeli authorities under certain circumstances, including extended residence outside the city. By the end of 1967, the term occupied Palestinian territories had entered the formal vocabulary of international diplomacy, referring specifically to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Nearly 60 years later, that terminology remains in official use by the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and the vast majority of the world's governments, even as the political reality on the ground has grown increasingly complex, layered, and, for the roughly 5 million Palestinians living in these territories today, increasingly difficult to navigate in daily life. In the years following 1967, Palestinian political identity, already forming in exile since 1948, hardened further under the direct experience of occupation. The Palestine Liberation Organization, which had been founded in 1964 under Arab League sponsorship, was reorganized in 1969 under the leadership of Yasser Arafat and his Fatah movement, shifting its strategy toward direct Palestinian-led resistance rather than reliance on neighboring Arab states. This period also saw the emergence of more radical factions and tactics, including hijackings and attacks carried out against Israeli and international targets, actions that drew widespread international condemnation and shaped global perceptions of the Palestinian cause for the following decade, often overshadowing the underlying territorial and human rights grievances that had produced them in the first place. By the mid-1970s, the international community had begun, slowly and unevenly, to formally recognize Palestinian political aspirations as a legitimate matter for diplomatic resolution, rather than purely a refugee or security issue. In 1974, the United Nations General Assembly granted the PLO observer status, and Yasser Arafat addressed the General Assembly directly, famously stating that he carried both an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun, and asking the world not to let the olive branch fall from his hand. That speech marked a pivotal shift in how the Palestinian cause was framed on the world stage, moving it, for the first time since 1948, into the center of formal international diplomacy, rather than the margins of regional conflict. What followed in the decades after would include failed peace talks, uprisings, and a slow, complicated process of both progress and setback that would eventually produce the fragile, unresolved political reality Palestinians live under today. One shaped enormously by an uprising that began in the late 1980s, born not out of organized political leadership, but out of the accumulated frustration of an entire generation of Palestinians who had grown up entirely under occupation, knowing no other reality. If this history is resonating with you, we made a shirt called Rooted in Dignity, a Palestine Solidarity t-shirt that supports this channel, with a portion of every sale going toward humanitarian relief for Palestinians. And if you want the rest of the story told in full, hit subscribe to Days Gone By. there's a great deal more history still ahead of us. By the late 1980s, an entire generation of Palestinians had grown up knowing nothing but occupation. They had no memory of a Palestine before 1967, no memory of movement without checkpoints, no memory of a life where Israeli military authority wasn't woven into the fabric of daily existence. That generation, born into a reality their parents and grandparents had never chosen for them, was the generation that would ignite what became known as the First Intifada. It began in December 1987 in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza after an Israeli military vehicle collided with a civilian car, killing 4 Palestinian workers. The deaths sparked spontaneous protests that spread within days across Gaza and the West Bank, evolving into a sustained, largely grassroots uprising that would last nearly 6 years. Unlike earlier phases of Palestinian resistance, which had often been led by organized militant factions operating from outside the territories, the First Intifada was overwhelmingly driven by ordinary Palestinians inside the West Bank and Gaza. General strikes, boycotts of Israeli goods, refusal to pay taxes, and most visibly to the outside world, young Palestinians throwing stones at heavily armed Israeli soldiers and armored vehicles. That imagery mattered. For the first time, global television audiences were watching the asymmetry of the occupation play out in real time, night after night. Israeli forces responded with mass arrests, curfews, deportations, and in some documented cases, live ammunition against demonstrators, including minors. By the time the uprising wound down in the early 1990s, well over 1,000 Palestinians had been killed, along with several hundred Israelis, the majority of them civilians and security personnel. Human rights organizations on both sides documented widespread abuses during this period, including Israeli military policies that, according to internal army records later revealed by journalists, explicitly encouraged the use of force, including broken limbs, to suppress demonstrations, a policy that became infamous under the phrase might, power, and beatings. The First Intifada did something else, too. Something less visible than the news footage. It forced a political recalculation on all sides. Israeli public opinion began to shift, with growing recognition that indefinite military rule over millions of Palestinians was neither stable nor sustainable. Palestinian political leadership in exile, led by Yasser Arafat's PLO, recognized that the uprising had shifted momentum in ways that could be leveraged diplomatically. And the international community, particularly the United States following the end of the Cold War, saw an opening to broker what had, for decades, seemed politically impossible. That opening led, in 1993, to the Oslo Accords, a set of agreements negotiated secretly in Norway between Israeli and Palestinian representatives, resulting in a now famous handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn. For many people around the world, this remains the image most associated with hope for peace in the region. And for a moment, it genuinely was that. The Accords established the Palestinian Authority, a governing body granted limited self-rule over parts of the West Bank and Gaza, and laid out a framework for phased negotiations toward a broader, final settlement, including the most difficult issues: the status of Jerusalem, the fate of Palestinian refugees, the borders of a future Palestinian state, and the status of Israeli settlements. But Oslo was, from the start, a framework, not a resolution. It divided the West Bank into 3 administrative zones: Area A under Palestinian civil and security control, Area B under Palestinian civil control but joint security control, and Area C, comprising over 60% of the West Bank's land, remaining under full Israeli civil and military control. That division, intended as a temporary 5-year arrangement leading to final status negotiations, remains in place today, more than 3 decades later, largely unchanged in structure. The years following Oslo were marked by cautious optimism, undermined repeatedly by violence from extremists on both sides who opposed the peace process entirely. Hamas, an Islamist Palestinian movement founded during the First Intifada in 1987, as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, rejected the Oslo framework outright and carried out a series of suicide bombings against Israeli civilians throughout the mid-1990s, aiming explicitly to derail the negotiations. On the Israeli side, Jewish extremist opposition to Oslo culminated in the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in November 1995 by an Israeli ultranationalist who opposed the peace process and any withdrawal from the West Bank. Rabin's death is widely regarded by historians and diplomats involved in the process as a turning point, after which the momentum toward a negotiated resolution never fully recovered. By 2000, negotiations reached their most ambitious point at Camp David, where President Bill Clinton brought together Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat in an attempt to finalize a comprehensive peace agreement. The talks collapsed without an agreement. The reasons for that collapse remain genuinely disputed among historians and participants themselves. Israeli and American officials at the time largely placed responsibility on Arafat for rejecting a serious offer, while Palestinian officials and some independent analysts have argued that the proposal on the table still fell short of Palestinian sovereignty requirements, particularly regarding Jerusalem, contiguous territory, and refugee rights, and that the negotiating process itself was structurally imbalanced. This remains one of the most contested episodes in the entire history of the conflict, and a fully honest account acknowledges that credible, well-documented arguments exist on more than one side of it. The collapse of Camp David was followed almost immediately by the eruption of the Second Intifada in September 2000, triggered by a visit from Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, a site of immense religious significance to Muslims, and a location Palestinians viewed as a deliberate provocation given the surrounding political tensions. Unlike the largely grassroots, stone-throwing character of the First Intifada, the Second Intifada was far more militarized on both sides. Palestinian armed factions, including Hamas and Fatah-affiliated groups, carried out a sustained campaign of suicide bombings targeting Israeli buses, restaurants, and public spaces, killing over 1,000 Israeli civilians over the following years. Israel responded with large-scale military operations inside Palestinian cities, extensive use of tanks and airstrikes in densely populated areas, and the construction of the separation barrier mentioned earlier. By the time the uprising wound down around 2005, more than 3,000 Palestinians and roughly 1,000 Israelis had been killed, and the political trust built during the Oslo years had been almost entirely destroyed. It's important to pause here and say plainly, this is one of the hardest parts of this history to tell with full honesty, because both Israeli and Palestinian civilians suffered enormously and directly during this period, in ways that shaped an entire generation's politics on both sides. A pro-Palestinian perspective on this history does not require minimizing Israeli civilian deaths from suicide bombings, just as an honest accounting of Israeli military conduct does not require minimizing the devastation experienced by Palestinian civilians in cities like Jenin and Nablus during that same period. Historical honesty means holding both realities at once. In 2005, in the aftermath of the Second Intifada, Israel unilaterally withdrew all of its settlers and military infrastructure from the Gaza Strip under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's disengagement plan. This is a moment often cited and often misunderstood in modern political debate. Israel maintained, and continues to maintain, that this withdrawal ended its occupation of Gaza entirely. Palestinian officials, human rights organizations, and much of the international legal community have taken a different position, arguing that because Israel retained control over Gaza's airspace, coastline, and most land border crossings, along with its population registry, Gaza remained under what international law refers to as effective occupation, despite the absence of Israeli settlers or a permanent ground military presence inside the territory itself. In 2006, Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank participated in legislative elections widely recognized by international observers as free and fair, and Hamas won a decisive majority, defeating the long-dominant Fatah party. The result stunned much of the international community, and it triggered a political and financial crisis, as the United States, the European Union, and Israel refused to recognize a Hamas-led government, citing the group's refusal to renounce violence or recognize Israel's right to exist. The following year, after a violent internal conflict between Hamas and Fatah forces, Hamas took full control of Gaza, while the Palestinian Authority, dominated by Fatah, retained limited administrative control over parts of the West Bank. Palestinian political leadership has remained split between these two governing bodies ever since, a division that has profoundly weakened Palestinian negotiating unity on the international stage for nearly 2 decades. Shortly after Hamas's takeover of Gaza, Israel, together with Egypt, imposed a land, air, and sea blockade on the territory, citing security concerns given Hamas's stated hostility toward Israel and its history of rocket attacks and armed conflict. That blockade has remained in place, in varying degrees of severity, for close to 2 decades, and has been repeatedly described by United Nations agencies and international humanitarian organizations as having created one of the most severe and prolonged humanitarian crises of the modern era, affecting access to clean water, electricity, medical care, and freedom of movement for the roughly 2 million people living in Gaza. Before we move into the final part of this series, the years from the blockade to the present day, and the question we started with, whether Palestine is a country, I want to mention something again. This channel exists to tell this history in full without cutting corners, and we made a shirt called Rooted in Dignity to help support that mission directly. A portion of every sale goes toward humanitarian relief for Palestinians, and wearing it is one small way to keep this conversation visible in a world that too often looks away. If you've stayed with us this far, subscribe to Days Gone By. What comes next brings us to the present moment and to the actual answer to the question this series set out to ask. We left off in 2007, with Gaza under blockade and Palestinian political leadership fractured between Hamas in Gaza and the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. That division and that blockade would go on to define the following 2 decades, shaping a cycle of conflict that most of the world would come to know through a series of major military escalations, each one deadlier than the last. Between 2008 and 2021, Israel and Hamas fought 4 major rounds of conflict in 2008 and 2009, in 2012, in 2014, and in 2021. Each followed a broadly similar pattern: rocket fire from Gaza into Israeli territory, met with sustained Israeli airstrikes, and, in several rounds, ground incursions into Gaza itself. The human toll in each of these rounds was consistently and dramatically asymmetric. In the 2014 conflict alone, widely considered the most destructive of these rounds prior to the current decade, over 2,000 Palestinians were killed, the majority of them civilians, according to United Nations tallies, alongside roughly 70 Israelis, the majority of them soldiers. That asymmetry, repeated across each round of fighting, became one of the most consistent and most debated features of the conflict. Cited by Palestinian advocates and international human rights organizations as evidence of disproportionate force, and defended by Israeli officials as an unavoidable consequence of fighting an armed group embedded within a densely populated civilian territory. Throughout this same period, life in the West Bank followed a different but equally difficult trajectory. Settlement expansion continued steadily under successive Israeli governments, regardless of which political party held power, growing from roughly 200,000 settlers in the early 2000s to more than 700,000 by the mid-2020s, when East Jerusalem is included. Palestinian home demolitions, carried out by Israeli authorities citing the absence of building permits. Permits that Israeli human rights organizations themselves have documented are almost never granted to Palestinians in certain zones, continued at a steady pace, displacing thousands of Palestinian families over the following years. The Palestinian Authority, meanwhile, increasingly lost legitimacy among the population it governed, criticized both for its perceived inability to protect Palestinians from settlement expansion and settler violence, and for its continued security coordination with Israel, which many Palestinians came to view as collaboration rather than governance. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas and allied Palestinian militant groups launched a large-scale coordinated attack on southern Israel, breaching the Gaza border fence and killing approximately 1,200 people, the overwhelming majority of them Israeli civilians, in the deadliest single attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hamas fighters also took roughly 250 people hostage, taking them into Gaza. This attack represented an unprecedented escalation, both in scale and in the deliberate targeting of civilians, including families in their homes and attendees at a music festival, and it triggered a war that would go on to become the most destructive chapter in the history of the modern conflict. Israel's response, launched within days, involved a sustained air and ground campaign across the Gaza Strip that continued for well over a year. By official Gaza Health Ministry counts, corroborated in broad terms by independent researchers, United Nations agencies, and even some U.S. intelligence assessments, the death toll in Gaza climbed past 40,000 people, with the majority reported to be women and children, alongside catastrophic destruction to housing, hospitals, schools, and water and electricity infrastructure. Multiple United Nations bodies, along with human rights organizations, including some based in Israel, described the humanitarian conditions in Gaza during this period as constituting a severe crisis of famine, disease, and mass displacement, with the overwhelming majority of Gaza's roughly 2 million residents forced from their homes, many of them repeatedly, as designated safe zones were themselves struck multiple times over the course of the war. The scale of civilian death and destruction prompted South Africa to bring a case against Israel before the International Court of Justice, alleging violations of the Genocide Convention. In January 2024, the court ruled that the case was plausible enough to proceed and ordered Israel to take measures to prevent acts that could fall under the convention and to improve humanitarian access, while stopping short at that stage of ordering a full ceasefire. The case remains ongoing and remains one of the most significant international legal proceedings in the history of the conflict, regardless of its eventual outcome. Separately, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants in late 2024 for senior Israeli officials, alongside a warrant for a senior Hamas commander over alleged war crimes connected to the conduct of the war, a decision Israel has rejected as illegitimate and that several of its allies, including the United States, have also publicly opposed. By 2025, mounting international pressure, war exhaustion, and shifting regional dynamics led to a series of ceasefire negotiations, hostage and prisoner exchanges, and phased troop adjustments, though the underlying political questions that produced the war remained, as of this recording, fundamentally unresolved. Gaza's reconstruction needs are estimated by the United Nations to require decades, given the scale of destroyed housing and infrastructure. The question of who will govern Gaza going forward, what role, if any, Hamas will retain, and what political horizon exists for Palestinian statehood remain open and deeply contested questions. Now, before we bring this full history to its conclusion and finally answer the question this series set out to ask, I want to pause here, because this is exactly the kind of history this channel was built to tell. Not filtered through a headline, not reduced to a single image, but walked through from its actual beginning. If this history has meant something to you, we made a shirt called Rooted in Dignity, a Palestine Solidarity t-shirt that directly supports Days Gone By, and a portion of every sale goes toward humanitarian relief for Palestinians. Wearing it is a small, tangible way of keeping this conversation alive in a world that moves on from these stories far too quickly. So now, after everything we've covered across this series, let's return to the question we opened with. Is Palestine a country, or is it Israel? The honest, factual answer is that it is both more complicated and more clear than that framing suggests. Israel is, without question, a fully recognized sovereign state. It has been a member of the United Nations since 1949, maintains formal diplomatic relations with the majority of the world's countries, and exercises full functioning control over its territory, its military, its borders, and its government. That is not in dispute. Palestine's status is different, and it is precisely that difference which lies at the heart of this entire history. Palestine is recognized as a sovereign state by roughly 140 countries around the world, a clear majority of the United Nations member states, including most of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. In 2012, the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to upgrade Palestine's status to that of a non-member observer state, the same status held by the Vatican, allowing it to participate in UN proceedings, join international treaties and bodies, including the International Criminal Court, and be referred to formally as the State of Palestine in UN documentation. What Palestine has not achieved is full United Nations membership, which requires the approval of the Security Council, where the United States has repeatedly used its veto power to block Palestinian membership applications, most recently in 2024, citing the need for a negotiated solution rather than unilateral recognition. So Palestine exists diplomatically, legally, and in the eyes of most of the world's nations as a state, even though it lacks full sovereignty on the ground. It has no control over its own borders, airspace, or, in Gaza's case, for much of the past 2 decades, its own population registry and movement of goods. The West Bank remains divided into the administrative zones established under Oslo, with the majority of its land under Israeli military and civil control. Gaza, following the 2023 to 2025 war, remains in a state of humanitarian catastrophe and unresolved political future. And yet Palestinian national identity, Palestinian culture, Palestinian claims to specific land, cities, and history long predate any of these modern political arrangements and are not erased by the absence of full sovereign control. This is, ultimately, the most honest way to answer the question this series set out to explore. Palestine is a nation whose people have an unbroken historical, cultural, and physical connection to the land stretching back centuries, whose political sovereignty was systematically dismantled first by British colonial policy, then by the events of 1948, then by the occupation that began in 1967, and whose path to full, internationally recognized statehood remains blocked today, not by an absence of historical claim, but by an absence of the diplomatic and political power required to secure it against the veto of powerful allies of the state currently controlling that land. Israel, meanwhile, is a fully sovereign, internationally recognized state, built in significant part on land whose Palestinian residents were displaced in the process, a state that continues to this day, meant to control the daily lives of millions of Palestinians who hold no vote in the government that governs them. Both of these things are true, and a fully honest history has to hold them together rather than choosing one and discarding the other. Palestine is not a myth, and it is not a country that never existed. It is a nation whose sovereignty was taken from it in stages, over the course of a century, through decisions made largely by other people, in other countries, about a land they did not live on. Whether Palestine becomes a fully sovereign state in the way Israel already is, remains one of the central unresolved political questions of our time, one that will likely define the next chapter of this region's history the way the last century defined this one. That's the full story, from the Ottoman era to today, laid out as factually and as completely as we could tell it in 5 parts. If you've made it this far, we genuinely appreciate you sitting with this history instead of scrolling past it. And if you want to support that kind of storytelling directly, the Rooted in Dignity shirt does exactly that, with a portion of every purchase going toward Palestinian humanitarian relief. And if this series meant something to you, subscribe to Days Gone By. There's a lot more history that deserves to be told this way, in full, without shortcuts. And we're just getting started.